right. Good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome today's speaker in the Arizona Think Tank for Behavioral Decision Making, Dr. Gerald Haubl, the Ronald K. Bannister Chair in Business and Professor of Marketing at the Alberta School of Business in beautiful Edmonton. Dr. Haubl is a distinguished scholar in the field of consumer behavior, with research spanning the psychology of decision making, choice architecture, and the dynamic nature of preferences. And his work has significantly shaped how we understand choice architecture and decision assistance for consumers. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Haubl. Gerald, the stage is all yours.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Martin, for the nice introduction. It's a pleasure to be here and always excited to share some of my research. What I'll talk about today is joint work with a former doctoral student of mine, actually, Sarah Way, who's currently at the University of Warwick. The focus of this project is, as you can see from the title, has to do with individual motivation and, in particular, how our experience of success versus failure shapes our motivation moving forward. So let's jump right in. Oops, actually, I'm trying to jump in. Okay, here, let's jump in. And just to sort of set the stage, and let me tell you a little bit about the kinds of activities that we focus on in this research. And I think it's a rather broad focus. So essentially, we're going to be thinking about activities that we engage in as individuals, that we complete, and once we've completed them, we experience a discrete outcome, which is either distinctly favorable or distinctly unfavorable. And so we might call those outcomes success versus failure. This is true of many activities that we engage in, both professionally, writing papers, submitting them for publication, but also recreationally, trying to climb a mountain like the one you see behind me, playing a game of tennis and things like that. And so that's kind of the first defining characteristic of the types of activities I want to be talking about. And the second is that these outcomes, be they favorable or unfavorable, are partly under the control of the individual. And in particular, the individual can exert effort in seeking to influence the probability of achieving a favorable outcome. So you can think of, I think quite a few activities that you all engage in with some regularity that have kind of these very basic fundamental properties. Of course, not all activities have these properties. Some activities have outcomes that are more continuous. We earn, grades or amounts of money or scores and so forth. And so in the interest of making some progress towards understanding these motivational dynamics, we are at this point focusing on activities that have distinct outcomes, also in terms of establishing an experimental paradigm that allows us to examine these dynamics. But of course, other activities that are beyond the immediate scope of this project are also interesting. And I think this research also shed some preliminary light on the motivational dynamics of outcomes other than just discrete success or failure. But that's where we're going to start. Now, we'll do this in a setting where we don't just perform these activities or these types of activities once, but actually repeatedly. So the research question that we're focusing on in this paper is actually quite straightforward. And it's essentially, what is more motivating to us? The previous experience of success at an activity or the previous experience of failure? So Sarah and I are interested in this question partly because we quite easily can come up with anecdotal evidence of either of those possibilities. We can think of situations where we were particularly motivated at a type of activity after experiencing success at it, but also of situations where we were particularly and more motivated by failure than by success. So we think this is kind of an interesting puzzle. And so that sort of motivated us to embrace this challenge and try to be able to say something robust about the kinds of situations where prior success might be more motivating than prior failure, and situations where the opposite might be true. There is, of course, much prior research on human motivation, and in particular on how different types of feedback affect human motivation. Interestingly, much of that work has been conducted in settings that we call one-time goal pursuit. So where the feedback might be how far you are along the path of achieving some some goal, completing an activity, earning a reward from a company, getting a free sandwich at the sandwich shop, and which is different from the focus of the current work, where we're really interested in actually completing an activity in its entirety, then observing an outcome that's either favorable or unfavorable, and then sometime in the future engaging in a similar type of activity again. Nonetheless, we know quite a bit about motivational dynamics, even just from prior research on what we call one-time goal pursuit, as it relates in particular to positive versus negative feedback. So here's some things we know. Work has shown that positive feedback tends to be more motivating than negative feedback when it signals goal attainability or self-efficacy. So when positive feedback signals that I might actually achieve this goal, or I sort of have what it takes to achieve it, then it tends to be more motivating than negative feedback. Other research on this topic has shown that positive feedback tends to be more motivating when it signals goal commitment, and negative feedback tends to be more motivating when it signals a lack of goal progress. I'll get back to that point in a second, but I'll acknowledge a third area of research that connects to self-regulatory focus. And that work has shown that positive feedback tends to be more motivating than negative feedback when people are more promotion focused. In other words, when they seek to achieve good things in their lives, but that the opposite might be true when they're more prevention focused, when their regulatory focus is on making sure that bad things don't occur. So this is all very inspiring, and we build, of course, on these prior insights.
Gerald,
But I
can I
wanted to
just ask
briefly
a
explain.
clarifying question?
Sure,
Sorry.
go ahead.
By
Sure.
motivating, I think especially in the second bullet, do you mean motivating in the positive sense? Like this causes me to want to continue to pursue the goal, or are you saying more motivating, like has a stronger effect and is actually demotivating?
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer, for the question. So we conceptualize it as having a positive effect on increasing motivation. So basically, motivating people to work harder, to exert more effort to achieve the goal. Does that clarify things? Yeah. Thanks for the question. So I just want to
So
return.
Gerald, sorry,
Go
I
ahead.
have a follow-up question on that. So when you see a one-time goal, when you see negative feedback, I can understand like, okay, so this is a goal, I haven't achieved it, right? So I'm motivated to work. But since you say this is a one-time goal, once I achieve the success, I succeed on this goal, then what's the motivation for next thing?
Thanks for the questions. So um, the contrast I'm trying to establish here and what we call one-time goal pursuit versus repeatedly performed activities is perhaps best illustrated by an example that's kind of familiar to all of us, which is working on a paper. And so what we sort of conceptualize as one-time goal pursuit would be, you're working on a manuscript and it's not quite ready for submission, and you reason about, well, how close is it? How am I progressing towards getting the paper to a state where I'm ready to submit it to a journal? And then you may get, feedback in that process. And by contrast, when Sarah and I think about repeatedly performed activities, it would be you've completed the paper, you've submitted it, and you got a decision from the journal. And so you experienced an outcome, and let's suppose it's accept versus reject, just to simplify things a little
Okay.
bit. And then our question is, so how motivated are you to work on the next paper? So how does getting a decision letter from a journal that's either favorable or unfavorable affect your motivation to work on a similar activity? So that I hope that clarifies things a little bit.
Yeah,
Uh,
so those
so it's
feeling
sort of within,
experience is what okay.
yeah. So it's kind of within the activity, and I'm
Okay.
making progress towards a goal, which in my example is completing the manuscript for submission. Um, whereas our focus is on kind of on a slightly bigger scale, which is I've completed the manuscript, I've submitted it, I experienced an outcome. And then how does that outcome affect my motivation moving forward, given that I'm not just working on one paper, but I'm working on, multiple activities of the same type.
I
Does
got
that
it. Thank
clarify
you.
things?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks for the question. So that sort of hopefully helps kind of establish the positioning of this work and kind of what we think we're adding to this vast body of literature that already exists on what you could call motivational dynamics. So again, just to recap, the key research question then is, so when are we more motivated? What increases our motivation to work at an activity more? Prior success or prior failure? And for this to be an interesting research question, the answer pretty much necessarily has to be, well, it depends, right? And so how we're trying to move the needle of understanding here a little bit is to introduce one factor that we think is key to trying to advance our understanding of this dynamic, the interplay of success versus failure with motivation moving forward. And that is how the activity is construed by the individual. And in particular, to the extent to which the individual construes the activity as what we call work or play. I want to clarify that we don't mean this necessarily in a superficial way. So whether the activity is simply officially work or officially play. And I think, I'm talking to a group of academics here. I think for all of us, the work that we do has playful elements. And so this is obviously a dramatic simplification of reality. And I'll actually, on the next slide, offer you kind of a sort of definition of these two construals and identify some of the key features of what we see constituting a work construal versus play construal. But that's basically our key argument, is that one key to understanding the nuanced nature of these motivational dynamics is to consider how an individual construes the activity in terms of this work versus play distinction. So what is work? We conceptualize it in line with, of course, much prior research, an activity with a narrow focus on the key favorable outcome that one strives to achieve. So, in other words, a unique focus on achieving the desirable outcome. And by contrast, a play activity, although still often a desirable outcome is sought, the key feature of a play activity in our conceptualization is that it is driven in large part also by the enjoyment of the process of engaging in the activity. So unique focus on outcome versus a joint focus on outcome, and in particular also enjoyment of the process, is sort of the essential distinction here. So this maps onto a bunch of things we already know about from much prior work in psychology. And the first one I already covered. So work is characterized in our conceptualization by an almost exclusive focus on achieving the desired outcome, getting the job done. That's what matters. It doesn't matter how I do it or the process. I just need to get the job done. I just need to achieve the outcome that I seek. Whereas in play, as I said, there's a mixture of orientations, but a much greater emphasis also on process orientation. This, of course, also relates to something we all know about, which is the distinction between extrinsic and intrinsic motivation. I don't need to give you a mini lecture on what that means, but essentially, extrinsic motivation is an external force. We do things because we seek extrinsic rewards and gratification, or because somebody has instructed us to do something. Whereas intrinsic motivation, it's internally generated. We do something because we enjoy doing it. We're inherently interested in the activity and so forth. So that also maps onto our conceptualization of work versus play. Another facet of this, which goes back to seminal work by Elliott and Harakovich on achievement motivation, is the distinction between performance goals and mastery goals. Where in work, we argue that resembles a focus on performance goals. And for those of you unfamiliar with this work, performance goal is essentially the goal to demonstrate how good I already am at an activity to the external world. Whereas by contrast, a mastery goal, which we argue is more associated with play, is focused on getting better at the activity. So performance goal, my ability is pretty much given, and my goal is just to demonstrate to the outside world how good I am. So for instance, in an educational context, it would be just, demonstrating how strong of a student I am, how good I am at this material, and getting recognized for that. Whereas a mastery goal is more internally focused and seeking on getting better, getting stronger at the activity, or achieving a greater ability. So we think that's also part of the conceptualization of work versus play. So the distinct focus on just demonstrating my ability versus getting better at the task. And all that can be kind of encapsulated by what we think of as a greater outward focus versus a greater inward focus. So we argue that in our conceptualization of work, there is more focus on and more reasoning about the external world, the activity itself, external forces, whereas in play, we tend to be more inward focused, more inward oriented. And then we believe that is kind of the foundation to allow us to make an interesting prediction about when success will be more motivating than failure moving forward, and when prior failure might be more motivating than prior success. And the story is basically as follows. So we're going to identify, based on this sort of simple theoretical framework, two key motivating forces that we're going to focus on here. One is an outward focused force, and that is how we think about the difficulty of the activity. So that's something outward. It's not about me. It's how hard is the task? How difficult is the activity? Versus an inward focus, which is essentially how good am I at the activity, my own ability. Of course, success versus failure is jointly determined by both of these forces, kind of in equal measure and in ways that are completely straightforward, right? The more difficult the activity is, the less likely we think we're going to achieve success. And conversely, the better we are at the activity, the more likely we think we're going to be able to achieve success. The focus of this paper is on sort of the differential weighting of these two competing forces. And so this is essentially our conceptual model in 2 slides. And I'm going to start with work, and I'm going to move on to play, and I'll illustrate sort of the contrasting predictions that we make for work versus play based on the background that I just tried to cover here. So let's start with work. And as a recap, so we think that work is more outward focused as opposed to inward focused. And so as we experience success versus failure, we can draw different inferences from that experienced outcome. We can make more outward oriented or more inward oriented inferences. And our key argument is that based on our conceptualization of work, that individuals are going to tend to infer something or be more likely to infer something that's external to them. And that in this case is activity difficulty. So prior success tends to be encoded as a signal, primarily as a signal of activity difficulty. And so, and the natural inference is that if I achieve success, the activity wasn't that hard to begin with. If I experience failure, maybe it was more difficult than I expected. And that in turn affects our motivation moving forward. So activity inferences about activity difficulty should enhance our motivation moving forward. In other words, I didn't try hard enough. This activity is more difficult than I expected. I need to step it up. I need to intensify my effort, which leads to the overall prediction that for work, prior success is going to be less motivating than prior failure the next time we perform that activity. And we predict the opposite for play based on the notion that under a play construal of an activity, we tend to make inferences that are more internally focused. And so the key way that we argue one encodes success as opposed to failure at an activity is as a signal of one's own ability. And so now success leads to a favorable inference about one's own ability, and that in turn is more motivating moving forward. So that leads to this contrasting prediction, just to recap, that under work, we argue that prior failure is going to be more motivating than prior success, whereas under play, prior success is going to be more motivating than prior failure. All else being equal, and of course, there are many other forces that are going on, including individual differences and other factors. So we don't, of course, neglect those, but our focus is kind of structurally on all with everything else that could be going on. Is there something interesting that we can tease out that is strictly driven by how people construe an activity in terms of work versus play? So that's that's our key prediction in terms of the outcomes and the underlying mechanisms. And the rest of the talk is going to focus on evidence from a series of experiments, in particular 5 experiments Sarah and I have conducted to kind of test the key features of this theorizing. And so let me begin by introducing the experimental paradigm that we use across these studies in different variations. But the core paradigm had to have the following desirable properties. So we're going to have people engage in an activity and more than once, because we want to examine the effect of prior success versus prior failure on motivation moving forward. So we needed an activity that's kind of simple that we can administer in an experiment rather easily, but that activity needed to be sufficiently ambiguous in terms of the way it is construed along the work versus play distinction. So we needed an activity that we could hold constant and then construe as more work or as more like play. we also needed that activity to be able to produce an outcome that is distinctly favorable or unfavorable. In other words, success versus failure. And finally, we needed that activity to be such that participants would be able to influence the probability of their success by investing effort. So that the probability of their own success would be a positive function of effort. But moreover, we wanted the activity to be such that no amount of effort actually guarantees success, just like with research. So no amount of effort we invest in a paper guarantees success, but usually putting in more effort increases the chance of success. So we wanted to capture that in our experimental paradigm here as well. So success is a positive function of effort. However, no amount of effort guarantees success. And that implies that the probability of success increases as a decreasing rate. So in other words, there are diminishing marginal returns to effort. So those were the key things that we were looking at as we sought to develop an experimental paradigm. And here's what we came up with. We call this the red ball task. So participants engage in an activity where they have a bowl. Typically, it's a virtual bowl that holds some balls, and in particular, a combination of two types of balls, red balls and white balls. They then get an opportunity to exert some effort, and that, I'll explain in a second what the nature of that effort is. And at the end of that activity, there is a combination of red and white balls in their bowl, and the outcome is determined by a random draw from that bowl. So either a red ball or a white ball. Sorry, that was a political Freudian political slip. Either a red ball or a white ball is going to be drawn from that bowl, and if a red ball is drawn, that indicates success, and if a white ball is drawn, that indicates failure. So then critically, what does that bowl look like at the start of the activity? At the start of the activity, there's some number of white balls. Typically, it'll be 30 with some variation, and 0 red balls. Why that? White balls imply failure. Red balls imply success. At the start of the activity, the participant has invested 0 effort. And so in our, the decision we made for this paradigm is if somebody invests no effort whatsoever, they should be guaranteed failure. So you've put in 0 effort, you shouldn't expect to succeed. So that's why we have this particular combination of white and red balls. So there are 30 white balls, 0 red balls. However, by exerting effort, the participant can influence the probability of a favorable outcome. And that is, we give them the opportunity to add red balls to their bowl. And the way they do it is by basically clicking red balls that appear on the screen in something that is a bit like a whack-a-mole procedure. I'll show you an animation of that in just a second. But essentially, they can exert effort by clicking balls that are the red balls that appear on the screen. And every time they click one, a red ball gets added to their bowl. And as I'm sure is obvious by now, as you add more red balls to your bowl, you're increasing your chance of achieving the outcome of success. But success is never guaranteed. Why? Because there are 30 white balls in the bowl that aren't going away. So there is always a chance that a white ball will be drawn, but of course you can change the probability in your favor by just adding a lot of red balls. So that's the basic machinery of this experimental paradigm. Here is just a short illustration of this whack-a-mole procedure where balls come out. Now this was designed to be not super fun, but also not super boring. So we pre-tested the pace of this and the duration for how long these red balls would appear on the screen. We settled on something that's almost exactly a second for how long a ball appears and can be clicked before it disappears. And so basically the success rate here is about 95%. So this wasn't a challenging activity. This was simply a way to allow participants, by exerting effort in this way, to increase their probability of success in the bigger task, which is the red ball task, where balls are drawn from this bowl that contains a combination of red and white balls. So that's the basic paradigm. As you already know, at the end of this period or this round of the activity, one of the balls from the bowl will be drawn at random. If it's a red ball, that indicates success. If it's a white ball, that indicates failure. Now, in order to study the dynamics of these experiences, and in particular to examine the effect of prior success or prior experienced failure, we needed at least 2 rounds of this activity. And so the basic paradigm, again, with some variations, looks like this. In round 1, participants are instructed to put exactly 30 red balls into their bowl. Note that there were at the outset 30 white balls in the bowl. So what that implies is that we can now actually, by randomly drawing a ball from participants' bowls at round one, we can essentially randomly assign them to having experienced prior success or prior failure. So in other words, assigning them at random to success or failure is analogous or equivalent to drawing one of the balls from their bowl, because they have exactly 30 balls of each type. And then in round two, and then so they experience the outcome of either success or failure. And then in round two, participants are free to add as many red balls as they wish to their bowl. And then when they're done, they again experience the outcome of success or failure. And critically, the number of red balls that they choose to enter to add to their bowl at round two is the key dependent variable in this paradigm. So that is an indicator of how motivated are they to achieve success at this task. So that's the essential experimental paradigm. It's obviously an extreme simplification of reality, but it is a simplification that we believe captures the essence of some of these basic activities that we want to make statements about. So experiment one. So in experiment one, we used 2 rounds of this red ball task that I just described. And this is our first attempt to test our theorizing about when prior success versus prior failure is going to be more motivating. So this experiment used a 2x2 between subjects design. The first factor is activity construal. I'll show you specifically how we induce that, but we essentially characterize the activity as either a work activity or a play activity. And the second factor is whether a participant experienced success or failure in round one. And the key dependent variable is, the key dependent variable there then is how many red balls do they add in round two as our key measure of their motivation. So how did we manipulate work versus play? To some extent, it was an instructional manipulation. So we characterized the task as work versus play, but we wanted to reinforce that manipulation and make it a bit more experiential. So instead of simply informing participants, your activity is work or your activity is play, we had them engage in what we call a bogus task selection task, where we tell them, you're going to do one of 2 tasks. In this study. One is going to be a work task and one is going to be a play task. Choose task 1 or task 2 below by clicking one of these buttons, and we will then tell you whether you selected the work or play task. And so irrespective of what the participant clicked, task 1 or task 2, we randomly assigned them to this either being a play task or work task. So in this case, the participant is in the play condition. We took some manipulation check measures to verify that our manipulation was successful. So the purple bars are the work condition, the orange bars are the play condition. And as we expected, in the work condition, participants actually view the task as more like work as opposed to play than in the play condition. And then also to kind of verify our conceptual narrative about what is work and what is play. And as you'll recall, I described a work activity as being more focused on more outcome focused as opposed to process focused. We see that reflected as a sort of a secondary manipulation check in this first experiment as well, where the work activity is seen as much more outcome focused than the play activity. Let's look at our key dependent variable. So this is kind of the first real test of our theorizing. So again, it's a 2x2 design between subjects. I'm going to show you on the left the results for work construal, on the right the results for play construal. And I'm going to show you 2 lines, a green line that indicates prior success on the previous round, and a red line that indicates prior failure. And just to remind you of our key prediction, we predicted that for work, left side of the graph, prior failure would be more motivating than prior success. Whereas for play, we would observe the opposite, that prior success would be more motivating than prior failure. And so far, so good. So the results from this first experiment are in line with our key prediction. So that for work, people are more motivated having just experienced failure at that activity. And for play, they're more motivated having just experienced success at that activity. One thing I'll point out, and this is true for all of the experiments I'm going to share with you today, and in fact, all the experiments we've run on this, is that the number of red balls added to the bowl on average is in the sort of 55 to 80 range, with very few observations that are below 30. I point this out because when you build an experimental paradigm that's kind of minimalist and doesn't sort of, resemble reality in all of its facets, you sometimes worry about task engagement, where participants engage with the task. this sort of little side observation in terms of like what was the level of effort that participants engaged to us was extremely encouraging, suggesting that when people were free to add as many or as few red balls to their bowl, virtually nobody said, yeah, one or two balls and I'm done. But they appeared based on this measure, and we have other measures to confirm that as well, to be quite engaged in that task and generally to be quite interested in achieving success at it.
Gerald, it's a
Yes.
quick question related to that. Maybe you said it, but I missed it. Did you provide any incentives for, like financial incentives for success or failure?
Not in this study and not in most of the studies that we have. And I'm happy to talk about that in more detail, perhaps at the end of the talk. But no, this was symbolic, right? So basically, good, you achieved success, or bad, you failed at the activity. We reinforced it with a big smiley or frowny face. And so one interesting thing, so maybe instead of deferring it to the end for the general discussion, one interesting thing that Sarah and I have learned in this is that it is very difficult to do this without a confound. So, right. So instead of saying you achieved success, you achieved failure, we could have said something like you earned $1 or you lost $1 or something like that. And, a greater financial reward could be a manifestation of success. The problem that we've run into, which I don't think is our problem, I think it's kind of it's inherent to these activity construals, is that as soon as you introduce a monetary incentive, it's very difficult to get participants to construe something truly as play. And so it's a little bit like, I don't know if I'm not a poker player, so I don't know much about it, but so I suppose you could play poker just for fun, or you could play it for real money or significant amounts of money. And so if even though you might think of playing poker as a play activity, but if you're or tennis would be a similar example. Like most of us think of that as a play activity, and yeah, you want to win the tennis match against your friend, but the outcome is essentially symbolic. You shake hands, and you're being congratulated. Maybe if it's a tournament, you get a small trophy. But if you're playing for $1 million, it's difficult to say, well, that is a play activity. So my point being that monetary incentives essentially turn almost everything into more like a work activity, and it makes it difficult to then tease apart the construal of the activity as work versus play from the monetary incentive. So that's I'm happy to talk about it in more detail if you're interested, but that is sort of in a nutshell the issue that we faced here. Does that make sense?
Totally. And another quick one, and who were your study participants here? Was it MTurkers or students?
It's a combination. I have to actually remind myself for round one. I think this was MTurk workers in study one. We also used some student samples in the lab, and it's always one or the other. And the results don't seem to seem robust to which kind of sample of participants we use. So throughout these experiments, we also examine a number of potential alternative accounts. One that I want to share with you in particular is that you might think, well, maybe there's a mood story here, right? So positive affect, it feels good to experience success. It doesn't feel so good to experience failure. Could that be driving the effects in some way? And so we took a measure of affect using a 6-item mood scale. And completely unsurprising, participants who experienced success, the green bar on the left, were in a much more positive mood. We did this after each round. We're in a much more positive mood than those who experienced failure. You could say, well, that's kind of a sanity check or a test of the validity of our paradigm. So we're quite happy to see this. But we're also happy to report that mood does not predict motivation at round 2, and critically, it doesn't interact with activity construal. So people are equally more happy having achieved success than failure, whether it's work or play. No interaction there, and critically, mood doesn't predict motivation at round 2. So mood is, you could say, it's epiphenomenal. It's also happening, but it's not driving the effect that we're examining. So in experiment 2, our goal was to kind of conceptually replicate the findings from experiment 1, but to replace the instructional manipulation of activity construal as work versus play, to instead use a different instructional manipulation and to instruct participants to focus on achieving the favorable outcome, on enjoying the process of engaging in the activity. And so because of this mapping on outcome versus process orientation and work versus play, our prediction is essentially the same as it was for experiment 1. So the paradigm is quite similar. So we use a 2x2 between subjects design. The key difference from experiment 1 is we now manipulate outcome versus process orientation as opposed to work versus play. And the second factor is, as in experiment one, did participants experience success or failure in round one? And we look at motivation in round two. So this is essentially how we manipulated outcome versus process orientation. Focus on the outcome and try your best to achieve success in the red ball task. They had already been kind of trained on what the red ball task is and entails. And in the process orientation condition, focus on the process and try to enjoy this whack-a-mole procedure. So the process of adding red balls to your bowl. So key result. What is the effect on motivation at round two? Kind of basically the same layout. On the left, we have outcome orientation. On the right, we have process orientation. I'll show you a green line for prior success, a red line for prior failure. And just as another reminder, our prediction is that for outcome orientation, prior failure would be more motivating than prior success, and the opposite would be true for process orientation. The results, again, support our theorizing and kind of nicely map onto the findings of experiment one. So far, so good. So it looks like we're getting robust movement, and in particular, this crossover as a function of work versus play, but also as a function of outcome versus process orientation, all else being equal.
Gerald, in that experiment, I just wonder why you chose to focus their attention on different aspects of the task.
So it was sort of our best attempt to induce process versus outcome orientation. So we didn't think of it exactly in terms of the way you just described it. But on the other hand, I'm sympathetic to your interpretation of it. In a way, outcome and process are different aspects of the task, right? So the outcome is I want to get the smiley face at the end. I want to achieve success at the overall what we call the red ball task. And enjoying the process is step by step. Every red ball that I add, and there's a particular sort of sub activity, you could say, that is used to do that. So I guess that's my answer to your question, why we chose to do it. But perhaps I'll ask you, do you see that as are you concerned about our choice there?
Yeah. Do you want to just go back one slide real quick? Make sure I
Sure.
understood the motivation.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's the one, right?
Yeah. Just wondering why it wasn't focus on the process and try to do your best to enjoy the overall task or the red ball task, or just try to, you could have said today's task in both conditions, something like that. It's the focus on the two different stages that just strikes me as something that I would want to think through more, as if there's an alternative that's jumping out there. But it has this flavor of not just being about process, but being about a different part of the experiment.
Yeah, I guess. So first of all, we did try a different manipulation that was more. It was different. It didn't have the sort of aspect that you're focusing on now, and the effects actually replicate there as well. So I don't think this is crucial, but I'll still sort of say, just in kind of in defense of our decision here, is we really think that this whack-a-mole procedure is kind of, it sort of represents the process. It's like the equivalent of, I don't know exactly what that would be for writing a paper. So, but so I'm thinking this through as I speak. So this may not be very insightful, but I could say that, we think about, submitting a paper to a journal. I guess the analog would be, focus on just getting the paper accepted, which is analogous to, success at the red ball task. And then the other could be, focus on every step of the process, on every little decision you make in building the experimental paradigms for your study and in analyzing the data. And so those kind of micro steps kind of resemble the process, and they are like a different task in some sense. So that's kind of my best attempt in real time to defend this, but
totally. I guess if I was trying to be like my reviewer 3 hat and just, I don't know where you are in the process. I mean, I would worry maybe there's a temporal element of this, or like I'm looking at the first task rather than the last task, or there might be some other unintended features, but to me it seems solvable if you were looking at focus on succeeding at research or focus on enjoying research, and then those seem equivalent, right? Overall, we want to enjoy the process, or we want to achieve an outcome, and it doesn't have to necessarily be I mean, confound is a strong word, and I don't mean
Yeah,
to.
no, I understand. I understand the point. I think it's a fair point.
Just to help you guys out, if you want to inoculate it in the review.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. Yeah, yeah. I think it's a point well taken. Yeah, thank you. Right. So moving on to experiment 3, this I think partly addresses Oliver's earlier question a little bit in that although we're not using monetary incentives here, we did want to make the task a little bit more consequential and move beyond the sort of simply success, smiley face, and have a more tangible or more experienced consequence. And so our attempt to accomplish this is as follows. So this is essentially an enhanced version of experiment 1, where we again manipulate work versus play construal. Participants have a prior experience of success or failure, but now that experience of success or failure at both rounds, both round 1 and round 2, is tied to, has different consequences. And that consequence is as follows. So the participants do 2 rounds of the red ball task, but they also do 2 rounds of an image coding task. And we informed them that if they achieve success at either round of the red ball task, they would get to do a more fun, more pleasant version of the image coding task in the sort of second phase of the experiment. Whereas if they achieved failure, they would do a distinctly less pleasant version of the image coding task. And we described, what those images would look like. We didn't use anything like super aversive, but it was, clearly going to be more or less pleasant. So that was kind of our way to make the red ball task more consequential. Key results. By now, you're already quite familiar with the format of this graph. So we again have work on the left, play on the right. Green line indicates prior success. Red line indicates prior failure. Our key prediction is that you can probably say it with me by now, that under work construal, prior failure is more motivating than prior success. And for play, prior success is more motivating than prior failure. And bingo, we get a nice crossover interaction as well. So the evidence seems to be piling up here in support of kind of the key outcome level prediction of this sort of crossover nuanced effect of previously experienced consequences on future motivation. And so for the final portion of the talk, I call this the let's cut some wires part of the talk. I'll show you 2 more experiments. And now we're going to move from just testing our outcome level predictions about, well, when are people more motivated, to actually testing the key features of our proposed underlying psychological forces that produce these effects. And I'm going to show you 2 experiments, one for work and one for play, and we're going to cut different wires in an attempt to turn off the effects that I've shown you quite robustly in the first 3 experiments, where the wire that we cut resembles the particular force that we think is primarily driving the effect for work and also for play, and they're different wires. So let's start with work. As a reminder, we argue that when an activity is construed as work, the primary way in which experienced outcomes of success and failure are encoded is outward focused. And in particular, it's about how difficult is this task or this activity. And so we argue that what's driving the effects I've shown you for work up to this point is that experienced failure is encoded primarily, along with other things, but primarily as high task difficulty. And then that in turn motivates me to work harder on round 2 of the task. So let's think about this. So how would we test this prediction about the underlying mechanism for work? Our thinking was that we need to find a way to make the experienced outcome in round 1 uninformative about how difficult the task is going to be in round 2. So that's our sort of blueprint or game plan for this experiment. So we want to make the outcome experience in round 1 uninformative about how difficult the activity is going to be in round 2. How can we do that in this simple world of the red ball task? Well, we start by reasoning about, well, what actually constitutes task difficulty? And the answer is the number of white balls, right? And so up to now, we've had a situation where participants were given a bowl at the outset. It had 30 white balls in it. One way to make this task easier is to reduce the number of white balls, right? So now you don't have to work so hard to achieve success or to have a high probability of success if there are only 3 white balls as opposed to 30. But if there were 1,000 white balls, it would be a much more difficult task in the sense that it requires a lot more work to get to the same probability of success. And so we harnessed sort of that feature of our paradigm And we now departed from fixing the number of white balls at 30 and telling and informing participants that it is so. We now told them, first of all, there is a number of white balls. Number two, you don't know what that number is. And number three, it could be any of the following numbers. So it could be a multiple of 3 between 3 and 57. So it could be any of these 19 integer numbers that range from 3 to 57, the expected value being 30. And participants don't know how many white balls there are. All else remains the same in this paradigm. And then the key manipulation is we inform participants that even though they don't know what the number of white balls is, that on round 2, it will be either the same as it was on round 1, allowing them to draw inferences about the difficulty of the activity in round 2 from their experienced outcome in round 1, or we told them it would be different from round 1, basically undermining their ability to draw inferences about how difficult it's going to be to achieve success in round 2 based on the experienced outcome in round 1. So to sort of recap, in round 1, participants are asked to put 30 red balls into the bowl, but now they don't know how many white balls there are. And they experience success or failure. Again, as before, the number of red balls they choose to add to their bowl in round 2 is the key dependent variable. And the key manipulation is there is some number of white balls unknown to participants. We could represent it by a letter like M, and that is either the same on both rounds, known to be the same, unknown in number, but known to be the same unknown number, or known to be a different unknown number between the 2 rounds. So again, rather than just simply informing people and that this is the case and kind of counting on them to be fully attentive and understand what we're putting in front of them as a text, we made this a little bit more experiential. So we had them select the number of white balls. And first I'll illustrate this for the same number of white balls conditions. So we showed them 19 clickable boxes on the screen, and we told them that each of these boxes represents a particular number of white balls. They're randomly arranged, so the position is uninformative, and their task is simply to click. It's like the bogus task selection earlier. Now it's like a bogus selection of the number of white balls they have. And in the same condition, they clicked one of these boxes before round 1. We told them, okay, fine, you've selected your number. We're not going to tell you what it is, but you've selected it. You've been assigned a number of white balls. And then at the beginning of round 2, to reinforce the notion that this is the same number as you had in round 1, we showed them a similar interface, but now 18 of the 19 buttons were disabled, were just represented as a little gray square, unclickable. And the only thing that was clickable was the box that they had clicked on round 1 to kind of reinforce that you don't know what the number of white balls is, but it's going to be the same. Whatever it was in round 1, it's going to be the same in round 2. And conversely, you could probably guess what we're doing here. In the different number of white balls condition, we had them again select one number of white balls for round 1. They click it. In this case, it's a different letter. And then for round 2, we now have 18 clickable buttons and only one that isn't clickable. And the one that isn't clickable is the number of balls that they had on round 1. Again, to reinforce that, it's going to be a different number. The number you had is sort of like sampling without replacement. You already drew a number of white balls for round 1, and now you're going to draw from the remaining 18 candidate numbers of white balls. So, of course, there would have been many ways to implement this. I'm just sort of pulling back the curtain to show you a little bit about some of the methodological tricks that we use to try to induce this manipulation in what ended up being a pretty effective manipulation. So to recap, the design is we manipulate the number of white balls in round 1. So this is all work. The entire experiment is about work construal. We manipulate whether the number of white balls in round 2 was the same as in round 1 or a different number. In all cases, it's unknown. And then again, the second factor, as in the previous experiments, prior outcome was either success or failure. It's again a 2x2 between subject design. And the same DV as before. How many red balls do they add in round 2? Okay, key result. So again, to recap for work, our key prediction is, or baseline prediction is that prior failure is more motivating than prior success. And we expect it to conceptually replicate that finding on the left of this graph when the number of white balls was the same between rounds 1 and round 2. But we expected that effect to attenuate and ideally vanish completely when we removed the basis for participants to infer anything about activity difficulty at round 2 from their experienced outcome at round 1. And again, that is the key mechanism that we predict is driving these motivational dynamics when an activity is construed as work. So the results support our theorizing. We conceptually replicate the baseline effect for work on the left when the number of white balls was known to be the same. In other words, even though I didn't know how many white balls there were, but I can learn something about the difficulty of the activity from my success or failure in round 1, and that informs me about how difficult it's going to be at round 2. And then when we removed that possibility, the effect goes away on the right side of the graph. Let's look at some process measures. So we measured how difficult participants felt that the activity was at round 2. In line with our theorizing, we see that when the number of white balls was the same, so when the experienced outcome in round 1 signaled something about activity difficulty at round 2, they predicted that the activity would be more difficult having experienced failure than having experienced success, which makes perfect sense. But when we cut the wire and we changed the number of white balls, that effect was attenuated, and actually the simple effect here is no longer significant. So that supports our theorizing. The other thing we measured was people's own ability. And here we predicted no effect other than the obvious main effect of success versus failure, so that all else being equal, experiencing success leads people to think that they're better at the activity. Makes perfect sense. But the key here is that those two lines are exactly parallel, so there's no interaction. And that suggests that between these two process measures, it confirms that our manipulation of number of white balls, same versus different, really targeted task difficulty specifically and didn't seem to spill over to other things, such as the perceived ability of the participant. So we're pretty happy with this finding. And then the final result for experiment 4 is a mediation model where we look at how does the previously experienced outcome affect motivation at round 2. And we have these two key pathways that will be no surprise to you, given everything I've told you up to this point already. So we argue that previous outcome, and this is coded as the effect of failure. So failure here is coded as 1. So prior failure is going to affect motivation downstream, particularly through two different pathways. One is a positive pathway where prior failure enhances perceived difficulty of the task, which in turn is motivating. So positive indirect effect via perceived task difficulty, and at the same time, a negative indirect effect potentially via perceived ability, where prior failure leads me to feel less good about about my own ability at this task, and that should have a negative effect on motivation. But then critically, we have moderation by our key manipulation of the number of white balls being different or the same, in particular such that when the number of white balls was different, the positive indirect pathway via perceived task difficulty is disabled, essentially, strongly attenuated. So that's in line with our theoretical story, that for work construal, all the action is in, or most of the action is in inferences about perceived task difficulty. But when we cut the wire and we remove the basis for participants to draw inferences about task difficulty at round 2, that pathway goes away. And then finally, last experiment, I know we're probably getting close to the end of our time window here. There's not a whole lot more that I need to share, but this is kind of crucial. So we now, in the last experiment I'll share with you, we do something kind of analogous to what we did for work construal in experiment 4, but now we'll do it for play construal. So we need to find a different wire that we can cut to test our mechanism. So the objective is to examine the key mechanism that underlies these motivational dynamics at play activities specifically. So as a reminder, our theorizing suggests that the key force in play, I shouldn't say in play, the key force at work, no, that also doesn't work. The key mechanism here for play construal is that people tend to draw inferences from their experienced success versus failure that are more inward focused. In other words, they're about themselves more than about the external environment. And so basically the inference is about my own ability. So just like in experiment 4, we now need to try to figure out a way to make the experienced outcome in round 1 uninformative about one's ability at the activity in round 2. So this is maybe the most challenging aspect of the entire paper so far, although it's really an extension or a generalization of what we already did in experiment 4. So again, we ask ourselves, what is the representation of ability in this experimental paradigm? Our answer to that question is basically what is the impact of 1 unit of effort that a participant exerts on their probability of achieving the desired outcome at the activity. So I exert 1 unit of effort. How big is the impact of that action on my probability of success? And so what we came up with is the notion of a multiplier. So now, unlike all the evidence I've shown you so far, where a single click in the whack-a-mole procedure resulted in exactly 1 red ball being added to the participant's bowl, now it's Q times the number of clicks. So in other words, for every click in the whack-a-mole procedure, there is going to be some number of red balls that gets added to the bowl. And that number, again, unknown to participants, could be anywhere from 1 to 19. So the multiplier is an integer number that ranges from 1 to 19. So there are 19 possibilities, and you guys are all great at math, so I'm sure you've already figured out the expected value of the multiplier is 10. And so the key to cutting the wire, as it were, in this study now is to not only make the multiplier unknown to participants, so we explain it to them. This is like in experimental economics. They know everything that's going on. We explain the notion of the multiplier to them, but then we tell them, but you're not going to know what it is. You know it's a number between 1 and 19, but you will not know what it is. And then the key manipulation is that unknown multiplier is going to remain the same between rounds 1 and round 2, or it's going to be known to be different between round 1 and round 2. And so by making it known to be different between the 2 rounds, we're undermining people's opportunity to encode the outcome at round 1 as a strong indicator of how good they are, their ability at this activity in terms of their efficacy, you could say, to achieve success in round 2. Very familiar paradigm. The only thing that we're changing here is now we don't talk about the number of red balls that are added, but the number of targets that are hit, because participants actually don't know how many red balls they're adding to their bowl because of the multiplier. And so the multiplier is going to be either known to be the same or it's going to be known to be different between the 2 rounds. We use a very similar experiential manipulation here where participants select a multiplier and in the same condition, they click on the multiplier, it's Q, and in the second round, they can only click Q again to reinforce that you don't know what it is, but it's the same as before, versus different multiplier. Now everything but the button that was clicked on round one is now clickable, indicating that you're going to get a new draw of the multiplier. So design 2 by 2 between subjects. The multiplier is either the same on both rounds or it's different in round 2. And of course, the experienced outcome in round 1 is again success or failure. To ensure that the draw from the bowl of balls in round 1 is analogous to randomly assigning people to experiencing success or failure at that round, we now had to increase the number of white balls to 300. Why? Because the expected value of the multiplier is 10, and we're instructing participants to hit 30 targets in round 1. So the expected value of the number of red balls they're adding is 300, but it could be as few as 30 or as many as 570, doing some math on the fly here. Okay, so key result. So the baseline prediction for play construal is that prior success is more motivating than prior failure. So the green line should be higher than the red line on the data point should be higher on the left where the multiplier was the same, but that effect should go away when we make the multiplier different, thus undermining people's ability to draw inferences about their ability from what happened in round 1. And that's exactly what we find. So we get a significant interaction, we get a significant simple effect on the left in line with our theorizing, prior success being more motivating than prior failure under play construal. And that effect completely goes away, directionally even flips for a different multiplier, but that simple effect is not significant. So again, we can look at some process measures here. Perceived ability moved in the way that we expected it, in line with our theorizing, so that when the multiplier was the same, they thought that their ability to achieve success at round 2 was higher after previous success than after previous failure, but that effect is attenuated when we cut the wire, when we told them the multiplier was going to be different. Task difficulty was not at all affected by the multiplier manipulation, which is nice. So it kind of shows that the manipulation was targeted and specific and didn't just sort of affect everything. And the only thing, of course, that shows up here is the completely obvious main effect of prior failure over prior success. So the activity is seen as more difficult, having experienced failure than having experienced success, which is not unsurprising and completely obvious, but that's the only thing that's going on when it comes to task difficulty. And then finally, we can again look at this as a moderated mediation. So now we have the previous outcome coded as 1 for success. So this is now the effect of prior success on motivation at round 2. Again, we have the same two pathways that are at work here. And one is that prior success has a positive effect on motivation via enhanced perception of one's own ability. And it has a potentially negative effect, and in fact, a negative effect on motivation via reduced perception of task difficulty. But then crucially, our manipulation of the multiplier being different or the same between conditions moderates this and targets the one pathway that it should affect, which is in this case the one via perceived ability. So that even though at baseline we see a positive effect of success on motivation via enhanced perceived ability, when we make the multiplier known to be different, that effect becomes non-significant and basically gets turned off. So that's all I have in terms of empirical evidence for you today. So just to quickly recap, so what I think we accomplish in this work is to move the needle just a little bit. Human motivation is a fascinating and complex phenomenon, one we know quite a bit already. But we believe that one thing we don't really know much about yet is this sort of dynamic interplay between prior success and prior failure in guiding our motivation moving forward. And I think we're taking a small step in the direction of actually beginning to understand that dynamic a little bit better. Our key point in this paper is that one factor that seems to matter quite crucially here is activity construal, in particular, whether an activity is construed more as work or more as play. Again, in work, as we've discussed, the focus tends to be more outward oriented, more about the environment in which I'm performing this activity, and in particular, how easy or difficult the activity is, so that the primary encoding of success versus failure is that it signals something about activity difficulty. In particular, prior failure signaling greater activity difficulty, and then motivating me to sort of step it up and intensify my efforts. And that's why we predicted and showed that in this case, for work, prior failure is more motivating than prior success, all else being equal. And that the story for a play construal is kind of completely different, right? Here, people tend to encode success or failure as more informative about themselves, in particular their own ability, how good or bad they are at the activity. You could say whether they're cut out for that activity. And so the key finding here is that prior success serves primarily as a signal of greater ability at the activity. And that helps us explain why, in this case, for play, prior success is more motivating than prior failure.